You're listening to Wildlife Control Consultant, where we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest management. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast, where we cover all things related to vertebrate pest control. All right, well, thanks for coming along, and hope your week went well. I am getting some podcasts out ahead, so I'm actually feeling pretty good. I'm a few weeks out, so by the time you see this will be in October at this particular point, but I'm recording in September, so I'm pretty excited about being able to get ahead of the curve, because I've got it's getting into training season, so my day job will be keeping me occupied and traveling for a while. So anyways, I'll be doing some traveling in the great state of Montana. But nevertheless, glad to have you here. I hope that you take a few moments and subscribe to the channel and ring the bell. And if you have questions, comments, thoughts, perhaps you'd like to be on the show, reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail. But before you reach out to me, if you're wanting to be on the show, do look at the podcast I made on how to be on the show so that you know what to expect. Well, I have been doing a fair amount of reading in the area of bait stations. And so, as you well know, bait stations are often required for the use of rodenticides, especially when they're going to have access to the public or non-target animals. So bait stations are often mandated by the label. So this week, we're going to talk about bait stations, and actually it's going to be about 4 podcasts are going to be covering the use of bait stations based on the research that I've been able to discover. And it has some interesting insights in terms of how we're using bait stations improperly, or maybe not the most effective way. So we'll have you look at that, and believe it or not, sometimes the research does contradict. So nevertheless, but in the meantime, do take a few moments, if you would, to take a look at my book here, the Vertebrate Pest Handbook, 3rd edition. It's I've updated Dr. Austin Frischman's book and narrowed the scope. He covered a lot of other vertebrate animals than what I expanded this book on. So I narrowed the focus and then kind of gave it an update. It's a little dated at this point, but you can still purchase it. I have the basically facsimile version at a very low cost, available at lulu.com. So if you're looking to get a hold of a copy at that of that 2nd edition, you're certainly available to get it there. He covers a lot more species. I basically updated the manual, but only focused on commensal rodents. And so, but I did delve into Paramiscus, okay, so your deer mice and your white-footed mouse as well. So, because they are often inside buildings more often than people realize. So if you're looking for a book that delves into this particular area using a question-answer format, so if you're looking for having questions that you may be able to give to your technicians or perhaps even quiz yourself, this would be a manual for you. So it's not just, line after line of text of reading that you'd have to do. It's basically teaching you on the basis of asking questions, and then you have to answer the questions. So I have fill-in, I've got matching, I've got true false, and that sort of thing. So they're all going to be pretty objective, and then except for the short answer, of course. So it can be a very easy way for you to sort of keep fresh on the literature and information that we've learned on the control of these important pests. All right, enough of all that. Let's get into the topic for this particular week. Let me pull up my PowerPoint here and get that started. So again, this is going to be part 1. I'm anticipating, I think I have 4 presentations made, so this will be the first one. And we're basically summarizing elements from the literature. And so we're going to look at different aspects about the use of bait stations and how commensal rodents interact with them. And that can be important for our use, because one of the challenges with bait stations, of course, is that they are a barrier to the bait for the target animal as well, because some neophobia So sometimes bait stations can maybe enhance consumption or detract from consumption. So we want to be sure we're using them to the best. So it is a barrier that can interfere with the efficacy of our bait, because if they don't eat it, the bait doesn't work. But on the same token, we're using bait stations to protect it from non-target animals and also protect the bait from weather. So there's a give and take here, and we want to maximize the give and reduce, of course, the take. So this particular week, we're going to look at the question of bait station placement. So one of the things that some companies do, I can't say a lot of companies because I don't have any statistical research on it, but I suspect it may be more common than we realize, and that is the tendency to just simply do bait stations by the numbers. And what I mean by that is that maybe your company policy is that if you come into a commercial account or a residential account, you're going to use so many bait stations per linear foot of that building. So you may have a bait station, let's say you're trying to control mice and perhaps an occasional rat, then you may have those bait stations placed every 30 feet or every 50 feet or something to that effect. And so the technician just simply looks at the house and gets get a general sense of how many feet there are there, or perhaps you may say there needs to be one bait station for every wall. Then that's going to change things as well. And so the question is that really an effective use of resources, right? We're all time stressed, we're all money stressed, because the client ultimately has to pay for that approach to rodent control, right? And if you're just using it by the numbers, is that the best way to position those bait stations? Because there's a cost to those, there's a cost to placement, and there's a cost to monitoring those. So we want to make sure that the bait stations are put in a way that's going to solve the invasion problem. This would be the true whether you're exterior to the building or interior to the building, right? Always remember that we're going to be following the label, right? The label is the law. But what is the best way to position these bait stations? And so this was an article that I came across that had rather interesting. It's published in 2010, so let me read it for you. It's by Matteo Patergnani, Lapo Mugini Gras, Giovanni Poglayan, Aldo Gelli, Fernando Pasqualucci, Marco Farina, and Laura Stancampiano. And the article title was called Environmental Influence on Urban Rodent Bait Consumption, and that was published in the 2010 edition of the Journal of Pest Science. So let me read that again. I'm not going to read all the names because I probably butchered a few of them there. You can tell it's kind of has an Italian authorship here, but it's Matteo Patergnani and Environmental Influence of Urban Rodent Bait Consumption, and it was published in 2010 in the Journal of Pest Science. And so this is the research that was done here. So the research that they did was in the city of Bologna, Italy, so a major metropolitan center. Bologna is a major city within Italy, and they had 2,500 bait stations placed. Okay, and they basically divided the city up into what they call 5 biotopes. So it is basically parts of the city that had sort of a similar environmental context. For example, one would have been like the old portion of the city. Another would be kind of the more modern portion of the city. One was, I believe, along the river. And another was going to be maybe in a more suburban residential area. You kind of get the idea. So they were trying to see how bait stations worked within these particular biotypes. And so it's a huge project that they had here. Now, so in each biotype, they put 500 bait stations. And 400 of those stations would be above ground, and 100 were placed in sewers. And then they monitored these over time. Oh, one more thing. Each surface bait station had to be at least 50 meters apart from the other. So it's not like they were gang setting these, right? So they made sure there was sufficient distance, and they're trying to figure out which bait stations garnered the most activity from rodents, right? Because if the rodents aren't feeding on the bait in the bait station basically is a lawn ornament, and a rather dangerous one at that, and expensive, right? Because you have to purchase it, you've got to anchor it, you've got to place it, and of course you got to put the bait inside of it, and then you have to maintain it. Otherwise, you're kind of wasting your time. And so what they did was they studied the environmental characteristics. They had sort of a grid that they would look at, and they basically determined what were the environmental characteristics within 25 meters, a little over 25 yards, within each one of those stations. What was the character? Was it just concrete? What kind of vegetation there was? And we'll kind of give you an illustration of what some of those were in a moment. So this was a massive study that was done. And it has relevance for us to determine, because if they can figure out maybe where we should be putting these bait stations, then we're going to have a better chance of using them more appropriately so that we get the kind of control for our clients that could be useful, right? So this is what it can apply for us here in the United States and anyone else who's listening to my voice. So here's what they had. They had basically, they found that certain environmental characteristics had the most significant impact on rodent activity, positively or negatively, right? So let me explain what this was. So they had more than basically these 7 characteristics. They studied a lot more than 7 characteristics. But what they found was that only these 7 were what's called statistically significant. And what they mean by that is that they were of such a level such that that the results just weren't a result of random chance. Okay, so typically, if you know anything about statistics, typically that is a p-value of below 0.5. That meaning that the odds of this being false is only 5%. That is, in other words, there's a 95% chance that this is not random. Now, there's always a chance when you're doing research, you can roll 6 heads in a row when you're flipping a quarter, right? So you could do it. It's pretty hard. It's pretty rare, but it is possible. And so that's the idea. So they would use that. Some of these were actually significantly lower than that in terms of the probability of it being by just sheer chance. So they had these 7 elements, and so what they had was vegetation, that is, what is the proximity of vegetation to the bait station? What was the likelihood of what they call food competitors, that is, an animal that would be interested in the bait station, because obviously that's part of consumption. What was the likelihood of predators, that is, predators for the rodent being in the area? What kind of an impact does that have on rodent use of a bait station? Then they had what was the relationship of food sources. In other words, if there's food available to the rodents near this bait station, what impact did that have? Next was harborage. That is, are there places that the rodents could live? Right? Are there abandoned buildings? Are there maybe open spaces? Whatever the case may be, are there places for them to live? Then they have what's called bait competitors. I have this screwed up. So food competitors is when animals are feeding on the same foods that the rodents are feeding on. Bait competitor is the animal that goes after the bait. That's why I have a snail there, right? Snails like to consume our rodenticide baits. And the last one that I'm going to mention here is water sources. That is, what was the proximity of water availability to rodents near these bait stations? So it's a lot, right? There's a lot to take in. But what they found was vegetation, bait competitors, harborage, and water sources had the most significant impact on the use of bait stations. So for rodents using bait stations, those environmental factors were nearby: vegetation, water, bait competitors, and harborage. Now you'll notice that my arrows are different sizes, right? So I have some wide ones there in terms of the positive, and then I have a dashed arrow coming from food competitors. That would means there was a weak relationship between the presence of animals that fed on the same foods that rodents would feed on. Their presence showed that was a weak correlation that they found. Now, there are two elements that were negative. In other words, negative meaning if you put your bait station in a location that had one or both of these two aspects, the likelihood of rodents using your bait station was lower than what probability would suggest. The first one, of course, is food. Now, we all know if there's competing food sources for your bait, don't be shocked if the rodents aren't eating your bait. So this is one of the challenges, of course, that New York City has in controlling its rats. You may say, well, why don't they just use more rodenticide? Well, maybe they should, right? But nevertheless, even if they do, there's so much garbage in the trash cans around New York City that the rats don't have to eat the poison bait. They can just feed out of the dumpsters and trash cans because there's so much food available for them in alternative means. So what that means for you is that if you have a client who won't clean up food on the site, don't think it's going to be easy for you to poison your way to control there, because why are the rodents going to feed on your bait if there's plenty of alternative food available? Right? That's the challenge. Now, there was a weak relationship between the presence of predators, and I just have a picture of a cat here. Obviously, there's other predators that feed on rodents, but there's a weaker relationship. It's not as strong because rodents obviously have adapted to learn how to live near predators, right? If they didn't, they would all be dead, right? So nevertheless, a really strong negative correlation between food sources and bait stations, and a lower correlation between the presence of predators. So even someone says, well, I have cats. Yeah, cats, or predators around the house are going to make it harder for rodents to be present and to use your bait stations, but they're not going to solve your problem. Okay? So let's go over that again. So the number one factor for whether rodents would use your bait station was the bait station's proximity to vegetation. The number two positive factor for your bait being consumed was, wait for it, bait competitors. Those are those snails, right? Well, it's obviously we want to make sure we eliminate that. The third positive correlation was the presence of harborage. So if there were places for rodents to live and you put your bait station there, your bait station had a high likelihood of being used by the rodents. And the last positive correlation, significant that is, was water sources, right? And then we had two negative relationships, that is food sources and predators. That is, if you put your bait station near food or if you put your bait station near predators, the likelihood of rodents using your bait station was lower. Now, think about what that means for those of you that have to control rodents maybe inside of a grocery store. Think of how hard it's going to be for you to control rodents in that environment. It's a food-rich environment. Or perhaps you're trying to control rodents inside of a feedlot or a cattle business, right, where there's tons of grain around. It's going to be very hard to manage that, okay? Doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means it's going to be much more difficult, to be sure. So let's explain this a little bit more when it comes to application in the real world. Now, notice I have three images on the screen here. And the image in the upper left shows this sort of lone bait station here up against the building, which is fine. But what is the likelihood of a rodent utilizing that bait station? Now, I can hear some of the criticism already. You're saying, but what if we have a rodent running across the mowed yard and he's going to want to enter that bait station to find a place to hide? That's very possible, and I can't necessarily rule that out, right? But if you have to make a choice with limited resources, is that the best place to put the bait station, or is it to put it near the vegetation here on the image on the upper right? And according to this research, it suggests that the bait station in the upper right is going to have a better chance of getting rodents to enter it than the one to the left. Now, could you have situations where you're getting rodents on the left? Sure. But remember, we're looking at volume here, not just a one-off, right? It's sort of like, yeah, you could buy a lottery ticket and win the big prize, but what's the likelihood of that happening, right? So we're trying to improve the odds here. Same way with the image in the lower right. You'll notice that it's on the left side of that building, but notice if the person put the bait station just around the corner, closer to those grasses, would that likely be a better spot? Very possible, because believe it or not, especially when we're dealing with things like mice and rodents, sometimes moving a bait station 4 to 6 feet can be significant, right? Something for you to think about. That certainly can be challenging to people who've been doing rodent control for a very long time, right? We sometimes get blind to alternative ways of seeing things. In the same way with you as homeowners, if you're trying to control rodents on your own, you've got to be thinking about, am I putting the bait station in places where the rodents actually are? Typically speaking, you don't want your bait station around concrete. No food there, right? So try to put your attention where rodents are most likely going to be, right? And that means vegetation, harborage, and water. So let's conclude here. Let me kind of summarize some of the findings here. Always consider the habitat where you're putting your bait station. What lives here? Remember, people have rodent problems because the environment allows them to sustain rodents there. If there is no proper habitat for rodents, you will not have rodents there, right? So something has to be there that allows them to survive. Always think about food and water. Where's the food? Where's the water? Now you may say, well, but the mice don't need water. Yes, I mean, they do have some ability to get moisture out of their food and also maybe some metabolic abilities to create some moisture for themselves. But mice will drink water if they have it. But even if they're not consuming the water, you have to think about water is necessary for vegetation, right? No water, no vegetation, right? A lot less vegetation in the desert, right? Just check out the Sahara, okay? So where you also consider harborage, where will rodents like to live? Rodents need shelter because so many animals want to eat them. They're cryptic, so they like to hide. Make sure you're putting the bait stations where the rodents are going to feel comfortable, not where it's comfortable for you to check. Right? And that's the big difference. Some of you are going to be under tremendous pressure, time pressure. You have all these different jobs. You're probably overloaded with jobs, and it's going to be hard. So it's going to be, the tendency is to put that bait station in a place where it's easy for you to check rather than what's going to be attractive to rodents. We need to flip that. Put the stations where those elements exist or on the trails leading to those areas, because sometimes your client may not have all those habitat areas, but the neighbor has it, right? And so you're not hired by the neighbor to go put rodenticide over on their property. You can only work for the client, but you need to be thinking about that house, that building, and its neighbors, and perhaps the rodents are living on your client's property, but the food resources are somewhere else. make sure you put your bait stations where the rodents can find them. And they're going to be looking in no better place than to put it right on the path of their trail going from your structure over to the resources next door. But this requires some time and ability to see those types of indications and evidences. Finally, blindly placing bait stations according to the yardstick rule, right? We talked about this, every 30 feet, every 50 feet is kind of counterproductive. And again, we're dealing with, you have limited time, you have limited resources, your clients have limited time, limited resources. So you need to be taking a few moments and checking. This is one of the benefits of the newer technology that's coming out, that you're going to be able to use technology to tell you, has any animal entered that bait station? If no animals enter that bait station in 6 months, maybe it needs to be moved, right? And of course, entering the bait station is different than whether they've consumed any bait. Okay, but if they haven't entered it, they can't consume any bait, right? So this is where you need to be thinking about, not just simply blindly going through the motions. At times, you may need to move those bait stations to better areas, because maybe you did a good faith effort first time, and then you're finding, all the activities on the west end of the building, not the east end. Well, maybe you need to only have one bait station on the east end and put some additional bait stations over on the west end. This requires you to evaluate what you're doing and the activity that you're having with your bait stations. All right. Well, I hope you found that helpful. Again, I'm Stephen Vantassel. There's my book, The Vertebrate Pest Handbook. Pick it up. It's available at Lulu or Amazon, or you can even buy it from me. But nevertheless, hope you find it useful. Love to hear from you. Hope you found this particular podcast helpful to improve our use of rodenticides in bait stations to control these important pests for our clients and for public health and safety as well. So hope you find that helpful. You can reach me if you need to have a question, comment. You can put it, of course, right here below this podcast, or you can reach out to me directly at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. Again, I'm Stephen Vantassel. I'm the host of the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast, talking about all things related to vertebrate pest management. That's it for this week. Take care, everybody. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant podcast. Vertebrate pest control is an inherently dangerous activity involving risk of bodily injury to you, others, and/or property. Vertebrate pest control also involves legal issues, so be sure to always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and/or other control methods when controlling pests. Wildlife Control Consultant LLC, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their affiliates are not responsible for your use of the information provided here. Always consult a qualified and appropriate professional before employing the information provided here.